Violet Nightmares by Edgar Morrigan. Chapter 1. The Dream Unfolds. The scent of fresh rain lingered in the air as Evelyn sat on the edge of her bed, her body still trembling from the latest nightmare. The room around her was dim, with only the faintest hint of moonlight filtering through the curtains, casting long, twisted shadows across the floor. Her hands, now clammy and cold, rested on her lap as she tried to steady her breath, trying to ignore the lingering weight of the dream that had haunted her once again. It had been the same dream, night after night, for weeks now. A thick, purple fog curled around her like a living thing, a suffocating embrace that filled her lungs with the heavy, stagnant air. She could feel the pulse of it, slow and rhythmic, like a heartbeat. But there were no people, no sound, only the oppressive silence and the feel of something or someone watching her. And then came the creatures. At first, they had been distant, mere flickers in the fog, just shapes that seemed to move in the corners of her vision. She had tried to dismiss them, chalking them up to the distortions of her mind. But lately, they had become bolder, more distinct, their forms twisting and writhing as they emerged from the mist. Their eyes glowed with an eerie, unnatural light, and their mouths twisted into grotesque shapes, dripping with something that wasn't blood. Each night, the dream grew more vivid, more terrifying. She could feel the creatures closing in on her, their rancid breath on the back of her neck, the foul odor of decay that seemed to seep into her very bones. But it was always just before they reached her that she woke up, sweating, heart pounding, her body frozen in terror. The nightmare always ended the same way, with her gasping for breath, sitting upright in bed, struggling to separate the line between dream and reality. But tonight was different. The moment she had woken up, Evelyn knew something was wrong. The air in her room felt thick, as if something unseen had slipped through the veil of sleep and entered the waking world. It was a strange sensation, like being watched from the corner of her eye. She turned toward the window, her pulse quickening, but there was nothing there, just the same empty street, bathed in the pale light of the moon. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't the first time she'd felt this way. Over the past few weeks, there had been subtle signs, small, almost imperceptible things, that made her question whether the boundaries between her dreams and reality were truly as separate as they had once seemed. Objects out of place, sounds she couldn't explain, and, most unnervingly, the faintest trace of that same purple fog that had seemed to follow her from the dreams. She shook her head, trying to push the thoughts away. It was all just stress, she told herself. It had to be. She hadn't been sleeping well, and work at the art gallery had been demanding lately. Her mind was just playing tricks on her, blurring the lines between the waking world and the world of her dreams. But deep down, a voice in her head whispered that something more sinister was at play. Evelyn stood up and walked to the window, her legs still shaky from the after-effects of the nightmare. She peered out into the night, but the street was quiet, bathed in moonlight. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary, yet the unease settled deeper in her chest, like a slow-growing knot. She glanced at the clock beside her bed. It was almost 2 a.m. She had to sleep again. She had to get some rest before the morning. But part of her, an irrational part, was afraid to close her eyes again, afraid of what would come next in the nightmare, afraid that the creatures would follow her even into her waking life. With a sigh, she pulled the covers back over herself and closed her eyes, attempting to calm the racing thoughts in her head. She reminded herself that it was just a dream. Just a dream. But as she drifted back into slumber, the air in the room grew colder, and the faintest trace of purple fog curled beneath the door, seeping into the room, unseen by her eyes but felt deep in her bones. Chapter 2. The Fog Grows. Evelyn awoke with a start, her body drenched in sweat. The room was dark, but the thick, oppressive fog from her dream seemed to cling to her skin, as though it had followed her into the waking world. Her breath came in shallow, panicked gasps, and the unsettling sense of being watched hung heavy in the air, making the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end. The nightmare had been worse than ever. The creatures from the mist had surrounded her, their eyes glowing with an unnatural light, their mouths dripping with something vile and inhuman. They had closed in so closely that she could hear their distorted whispers, the voices echoing in her ears, their breath cold and foul against her skin. She had tried to scream, tried to run, but her legs had been paralyzed, trapped in place by the force of their gaze. Just before the creatures reached her, she had woken up just as she always did. But this time, something was different. The air in her room felt thick, as though it was heavier than it should be. Her mind raced to explain the sensation. Was it just the lingering effects of the nightmare? Or was something more insidious at play? She tried to shake the feeling, but it wouldn't leave. It was as if the nightmare had not ended, but had merely shifted, creeping into her reality. Evelyn sat up in bed, wiping the sweat from her forehead, and glanced around the room. The dim moonlight still filtered through the curtains, casting soft shadows across the walls. The night was quiet, the only sound the occasional creak of the old house settling, but then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw it. A faint wisp of purple fog, curling around the edges of the room. At first, she thought her eyes were playing tricks on her, a lingering remnant of the nightmare clinging to her mind. But as she stared, the fog seemed to grow thicker, creeping along the floor and up the walls, its color deepening into a richer, more vibrant hue. Her heart pounded in her chest, and she rushed to the door, flinging it open. The hallway outside her bedroom was empty, the silence almost deafening. But the air felt strange, charged with a palpable energy that made the hairs on her arms stand up. The fog was everywhere now. Evelyn hesitated for a moment, unsure of what to do. She had to get out of the house, away from whatever this was. The nightmares had bled into her waking world, and she could no longer deny it. The creatures from her dreams were no longer confined to the dark corners of her mind. They had found a way to cross into reality. The thought sent a chill through her, but she pushed it aside and hurried down the hallway, her footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. As she descended the stairs, the fog grew heavier, curling around the banister, swirling in strange patterns that seemed to shift with a mind of their own. Evelyn's pulse quickened. She was certain now this was no ordinary fog. It was the same fog from her dreams, the same suffocating, choking presence that had haunted her night after night. At the bottom of the stairs, she stopped, her heart racing. The living room, usually so familiar, looked alien in the dim light. The fog seemed to distort the room, warping the shapes of the furniture, casting eerie shadows that moved like living things. And there, in the center of the room, stood a figure. The figure was cloaked in shadow, a silhouette against the fog. Evelyn's breath caught in her throat as she stared at it. It wasn't one of the creatures from her dream, but it felt just as menacing. Its presence was undeniable, like the weight of an ancient curse pressing down on her chest. "Who are you?" she whispered, her voice trembling in the silence. The figure didn't answer. It simply stood there, unmoving, as if waiting for something. The air around it felt thick with an ancient, malevolent force, and Evelyn could feel a strange pull, like the figure was drawing her in, urging her to come closer, but she couldn't move. Her feet were frozen to the floor, her body locked in place by a fear so deep, it seemed to reach into her very soul. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, as if satisfied with its silent torment, the figure began to fade, dissolving into the fog like a wisp of smoke. The fog, too, began to dissipate, leaving Evelyn alone in the eerie stillness of the room, but the sense of dread lingered, hanging in the air like a suffocating cloud. She could still feel the presence of the figure, even though it was gone. And deep within her, she knew the nightmare had only just begun. Chapter 3: The Reality Fractures. The following morning, Evelyn found herself staring at the pale, morning sun filtering through her bedroom window, but it felt wrong, distant, almost foreign. The air in the house still felt heavy, as if the very walls were holding their breath. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply amiss. Her mind was still reeling from the events of the night before: the fog, the shadowy figure, the lingering sense that her nightmare had crossed over into her waking life. She stood up slowly, her body stiff and weary from the restless night. Despite the sunlight outside, an oppressive weight pressed down on her chest, the remnants of her terror clinging to her like a second skin. Her fingers trembled as she tugged on her robe, the soft fabric doing little to comfort her. She stepped into the hallway, hoping that the bright daylight would help dispel the remnants of her fear. But as she moved through the house, the oppressive atmosphere remained, thickening with every step. The familiar rooms, once comforting, now seemed unfamiliar, warped by the shadows and strange sensations that clung to the corners of her vision. The kitchen was quiet, the only sound the gentle hum of the refrigerator. Evelyn opened the cabinet to retrieve a mug, her movements slow and mechanical. Her mind was still racing, trying to piece together the events of the previous night. Had she imagined it all? Was it just a dream? Or had something truly crossed over from the realm of nightmares into her reality? As she reached for the coffee pot, something caught her eye. A faint, purple haze drifted just beyond the edge of her vision. She spun around, her heart racing, but when she turned fully, there was nothing. The room was exactly as it should be. Her breath caught in her throat. It had happened again. It wasn't her imagination. The fog, the oppressive weight, the sense of wrongness, they were real. She wasn't losing her mind. The creatures, the dark figure, everything had followed her from the nightmare, and now it was creeping into her world, warping her perception of reality. Evelyn took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. She couldn't keep living like this, trapped between two worlds, neither of which felt real anymore. But there was only one thing she could do: find answers. The nightmares had to have a source, a reason for why they were bleeding into her waking life. Her mind wandered back to the dream itself, to the way the fog had felt, the creatures that had lurked within it. She had seen them before, but they hadn't been as vivid, as tangible, as they were now. They had been shadows in the dark, but last night, they had been so close, too close. Evelyn's thoughts turned to the one thing she hadn't yet considered: the house itself. She had moved into this old Victorian mansion only a year ago, after inheriting it from an aunt she barely knew. The house had been abandoned for decades, and there was an eerie quality to it, as if it was holding on to something, some dark secret, some hidden history that had been buried deep within its walls. Had it been the house that had awakened something within her dreams? Or had the house itself been cursed, drawing her into this nightmare in ways she couldn't comprehend. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps behind her. She spun around, her heart leaping into her throat. But when she turned, there was no one there, just the empty hallway, the silence pressing in on her from every side. Evelyn's pulse hammered in her chest. She wasn't imagining things. The footsteps had been real, even if they were invisible. She had heard them too clearly to dismiss them as a figment of her imagination. The fear that had been building steadily inside her began to rise in her chest, a tidal wave threatening to crash over her. She couldn't deny it any longer. Something was terribly wrong. Her fingers trembling, Evelyn reached for her phone. She had to talk to someone. Someone who might understand, someone who could help. But as her hand hovered over the screen, a sudden thought struck her. What if no one could help? What if this nightmare was her own burden to bear, a curse that she would have to face alone? She shut her eyes, forcing herself to take a breath, to push the panic down. She couldn't afford to lose control. Not now. She had to find a way to stop this, to keep herself from falling deeper into whatever nightmare had begun to bleed into her reality. And so, with a heavy heart and a mind clouded with fear, Evelyn made a decision. She would start by searching the house. She would comb every room, every corner, looking for any sign, anything that could explain what was happening to her. Maybe there was something hidden in the house, some clue that could lead her to the truth. Evelyn didn't know what she would find, but she had no choice. She couldn't keep running from the truth, from the nightmare that was slowly consuming her. It was time to face it head-on. Chapter 4: The Forgotten Room. Evelyn spent the rest of the morning and into the afternoon methodically searching the house. She started in the attic, a small, cramped space filled with dust and forgotten things. The light from the narrow windows barely illuminated the space, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch and writhe in the corners of her vision. She checked every box, every chest, hoping for some clue, anything that might explain what was happening to her, but there was nothing. Only relics of a past long forgotten, old furniture covered in sheets, books yellowed with age, and broken objects that seemed to speak of a time before her. She felt a growing unease, as if the house was watching her, as if it were alive and aware of her every movement. Still, she pressed on, moving through each room with increasing urgency, her every step heavier than the last. She ventured into the basement next. The air down there was thick, oppressive, the smell of damp earth and mildew filling her nostrils. The walls seemed to close in around her, and the only sound was the faint creaking of the old house as it shifted in the breeze. The basement was as empty as the rest of the house, except for one thing. In the farthest corner, behind a heavy stack of crates, there was a door. It was old and weathered, the wood chipped and worn, and it stood out starkly against the cracked stone walls. Evelyn's heart skipped a beat when she saw it. She hadn't noticed it before. The house was vast, and she had never ventured this deep into the basement. Curiosity stirred within her, but she felt a flicker of hesitation. There was something about the door that felt wrong. It beckoned her, but not in a way that felt welcoming. It felt like an invitation to a dark secret, one that had been hidden away for a reason. But Evelyn had come this far, and she couldn't stop now. The dreams, the fog, the shadowy figure, it all had to mean something. This door might be the key to understanding everything, to unraveling the mystery that had taken hold of her life. Her hand trembled as she reached for the door handle. The moment her fingers brushed against the cold metal, a chill shot up her spine, a sensation so intense it made her stomach churn. She hesitated for a moment, but then, with a deep breath, she turned the handle. The door creaked open with a sound that made Evelyn's blood run cold. Beyond it was a narrow, spiraling staircase that descended further into the darkness. The air was stale and smelled faintly of decay, and the temperature dropped sharply as she stepped inside. Her pulse quickened, but she couldn't turn back now. With each step down the staircase, the world above seemed to fade away, as if she were descending into another realm entirely. The walls were lined with stone, smooth and cold to the touch, and the silence was absolute. There were no creaks, no sounds of life, just the oppressive stillness of a place long forgotten. The staircase seemed to go on forever, and as Evelyn descended, she felt an overwhelming sense of isolation. The darkness pressed in on her from all sides, and she could feel the weight of the house bearing down on her. The air grew thick, suffocating, and with each step, her mind seemed to unravel a little more, as if the house itself were pulling her deeper into its grasp. Finally, the stairs ended in a small, dimly lit room. The light came from a single, flickering candle resting on a stone pedestal in the center of the room. The shadows cast by the candle seemed to dance on the walls, moving in unnatural patterns. Evelyn's breath caught in her throat as her eyes scanned the room. The floor was covered in a thick layer of dust, and the walls were lined with shelves, most of them empty except for a few scattered objects: old books, a rusted lantern, and strange symbols carved into the stone. The symbols seemed to shift and change as Evelyn stared at them, and she felt a deep unease settle in her chest. There was something ancient about this room, something that felt wrong on a primal level, but it wasn't the symbols that held her attention. It was the large, ornate mirror hanging on the far wall. The mirror was old, its frame carved from dark wood, its surface cracked and covered in layers of dust. But there was something about it that was different. Something about the way the glass reflected the dim light made Evelyn's heart race. She couldn't look away. As she approached it, the air seemed to grow colder, and the shadows around her deepened. She reached out, her fingers brushing against the glass. For a moment, there was nothing. Just the reflection of the dimly lit room, the flickering candle, and her own face staring back at her. But then, something moved in the reflection. Her heart leaped in her chest, and she stumbled back. For a moment, she thought she had imagined it. But when she looked again, the reflection was different. There, in the glass, was a figure, a shadowy shape, barely visible in the dim light, but unmistakably there. It stood behind her, silent, watching. Evelyn spun around, her breath catching in her throat, but the room was empty. There was nothing there, no one. Her pulse raced as she turned back to the mirror. The figure was gone. But the air in the room had changed. It was thick with an energy she couldn't explain, as if the house itself were alive, and it was watching her. Her hand shook as she reached for the mirror again, this time pressing her palm against the cool glass. And in the reflection, she saw it, beneath the surface of the glass, a pair of glowing eyes staring back at her. The same eyes from her nightmares. She gasped, her mind struggling to comprehend what she was seeing. This wasn't just a reflection. This was something else, something dark and ancient, and it was reaching out to her. The shadows in the room seemed to shift, closing in on her. The figure in the mirror was no longer just a reflection. It was real, its presence now filling the space around her, suffocating her. Evelyn's breath came in short gasps as she stumbled back from the mirror, her heart hammering in her chest. The room seemed to close in on her, the walls pressing in as if they were alive, and the air was thick with the weight of something unseen, something ancient, something hungry. And she knew, without a doubt, that the nightmare had come for her. Chapter 5. The Waking Dream. Evelyn stumbled back, her heart pounding, her breath ragged as she struggled to steady herself. The room felt suffocating, the walls seemingly closing in around her. Her vision blurred, and the floor seemed to shift beneath her feet. The eyes in the mirror, those glowing, malevolent eyes, seemed to follow her every move, burning into her soul with an intensity that left her weak and trembling. She reached for the door, her hand shaking as she tried to turn the knob, but it wouldn't budge. The door, once a symbol of escape, now felt like a trap, holding her in place, keeping her from the sanity she so desperately sought. She pulled and twisted the handle in frantic desperation, but the door remained stubbornly closed. The darkness of the room seemed to press in on her, thick and oppressive. The flickering candlelight danced erratically, casting grotesque shadows that stretched and contorted like dark figures clawing their way toward her. The mirror was no longer just a reflection. The figure within it, the shadow that had once been a mere outline, had now solidified into something far more tangible. It was no longer distant, ethereal, as if a part of her own waking dream. No, now it was a presence, an entity, its form obscured by shifting shadows, but its eyes, those glowing, luminous eyes, pierced through the darkness like twin beacons. Evelyn gasped, her pulse quickening as her thoughts spiraled, unable to make sense of what was happening. The lines between dream and reality had begun to blur so completely that she no longer knew what was real. The air grew colder, impossibly cold, and her breath came in visible clouds. She reached out again, but this time, it wasn't to the door. Her fingers hovered, trembling, over the surface of the mirror. She could feel something almost electric, beneath the glass, as though it were alive, waiting for her touch. Her reflection shifted. Her own face in the glass began to change. Her eyes grew darker, her expression twisted into something unfamiliar, something that wasn't her. The skin around her mouth curled upward in a grotesque grin, sharp and twisted, and her own voice, her own whisper echoed in her mind, "You cannot escape." The whisper reverberated in her skull, echoing in waves. Evelyn's body went cold, her heart a heavy, suffocating weight in her chest. She backed away from the mirror, stumbling, her hands pressed against the walls for support. Her breath hitched, her mind spiraling into a cacophony of racing thoughts, but one thought remained, clear and unrelenting. She needed to wake up. Everything was wrong. This house, the nightmare, the creatures, it wasn't real. It couldn't be. She had to be dreaming. This couldn't be happening. She squeezed her eyes shut, praying for the nightmare to end, but when she opened them, nothing had changed. The room was still dark, still pulsing with that otherworldly energy. The mirror still stood before her, and the figure behind it was no longer just watching. It was moving. The shadow in the glass began to writhe, stretching and bending in unnatural ways. It reached toward her, its arms long and contorted, clawing at the mirror as if trying to escape. Evelyn's heart hammered in her chest as she stumbled backward, her vision spinning. She turned and ran, her footsteps echoing in the silence as she raced up the staircase, her breath shallow and panicked. She could hear the shadows following her, feel them, as though they were brushing against her skin, grazing her every step. She dared not look behind her, but the sound of her own footsteps, now joined by something darker, was enough to make her stomach churn with fear. She reached the top of the stairs, her legs heavy and trembling, and bolted through the basement door. But as she crossed the threshold, she stopped dead in her tracks. The door had disappeared. It was gone, replaced by an unbroken wall of stone. The darkness behind her pressed closer, colder, suffocating her, and her pulse raced as she turned in every direction, trying to find a way out. There was no way out. The house had shifted. The walls, the floors, the very foundation had twisted and warped as though the house itself had become a living, breathing thing, a nightmarish entity that could not be outrun. Evelyn's breath came in ragged gasps as she stumbled backward into the dark void of the basement, her eyes wide with terror. She was trapped. The shadows now surrounded her, thick and impenetrable, seeping into her mind, her thoughts, like a disease. They whispered, their voices low and sinister, pulling at the edges of her sanity. She was no longer just fighting for her life, she was fighting for her soul, and somewhere deep within the house, she could feel it, a presence, ancient and cold, watching her, waiting for her to break. It was the same presence that had been in her nightmares. The same figure whose eyes had haunted her every waking moment. It was here, now, in the room with her. In the house. It wasn't just a nightmare. It was real. Evelyn's chest tightened as her mind struggled to comprehend the impossible. This was no ordinary house, no ordinary dream. This was something far darker, far older than anything she had ever imagined, and the creature that had been stalking her dreams was real, too. It had crossed into her world. The darkness grew thicker, consuming everything, until Evelyn was swallowed whole. She could no longer feel the ground beneath her feet, could no longer hear the whispers in her mind. The shadows took over, melding with her very soul, and the last thing she saw before she succumbed to the abyss was the figure from the mirror. Its glowing eyes, now impossibly close, staring into her very essence, pulling her into the nightmarish void, and then, nothing. Chapter 6: Fractured Realities. Evelyn awoke with a sharp breath, her body jerking upright as if wrenched from the depths of some suffocating abyss. Her hands gripped the sheets beneath her, knuckles white, heart thundering in her chest. For a long moment, she simply stared into the dimly lit room, the remnants of the nightmare clinging to her like a second skin. But the room wasn't her bedroom. It wasn't the house she had come to know so well, the one that had slowly twisted itself into something unrecognizable. No. This place, this was somewhere new. The walls, though still old and decaying, were lined with unfamiliar patterns, strange symbols etched into the wallpaper, as if they had been placed there intentionally to disturb her. The air was thick with the scent of rot, but it wasn't the typical dampness of the manor's walls. This was something different, something wrong. She ran her fingers over her face, feeling the sweat that had already soaked through her hair. Her reflection in the mirror across the room startled her. Her eyes were wide, rimmed with dark circles, her skin pale as if she had been awake for days. But that wasn't the worst of it. The worst was the hollow emptiness behind her eyes, like she had lost something that she could never retrieve. And then the door creaked. It wasn't the soft groan of old wood. No, this was louder, more deliberate, as though someone, something, was standing on the other side, testing the lock, waiting for her to make the first move. The sound of it filled the room, echoing like a heartbeat in her ears. Evelyn froze, her heart rate spiked again, and her breath hitched. She should run, escape, do something, but all she could do was sit there, watching as the handle slowly began to turn, inch by inch, until it stopped. A long, bone-chilling silence followed. And then, slowly, as though toying with her, there came a soft knock. It wasn't like any knock a human could make. No, this was different. It reverberated in her chest, in her bones, as though the very walls of the room were sending a message, a warning. Her instincts screamed at her to flee, but her body betrayed her, remaining rooted in place as the door groaned open through the gap. A single figure stood motionless. The silhouette was barely discernible in the shadows, its outline blurred, like a stain against the dim light. But its eyes, their glowing intensity, pierced the darkness like twin stars. Evelyn's blood ran cold. This wasn't a dream. This wasn't something she could wake up from. The figure didn't speak, didn't move. It simply stood there, observing her, its presence suffocating, weighing down the very air in the room. And in its gaze, Evelyn saw something she hadn't seen before, something far worse than the creeping shadows and whispered words that had haunted her dreams. It was hunger. A hunger that wasn't just for flesh. It was deeper, primal, the kind that consumed more than the body. It devoured the soul. Her breath quickened, panic swelling in her chest as she stumbled backward, her hand scrabbling for purchase on the cold, damp walls. Her legs gave way beneath her, and she collapsed to the floor, unable to tear her eyes away from the figure in the doorway. She wanted to scream, to run, but her throat closed up, constricting with fear. The figure stepped into the room, its movements slow and deliberate. The door creaked shut behind it, the sound like the finality of a tomb closing. The air grew impossibly colder, and Evelyn felt the temperature drop to a near-frozen chill. A soft voice, low and guttural, broke the silence. You should never have entered. It was her voice. It came from her lips, but it wasn't her speaking. The words felt alien, like they were slipping from the darkness that surrounded her, not from her own mouth. She looked up, her vision swimming as the figure moved closer, its form becoming clearer, though still distorted by shadows. She could make out the shape of its face, pale, with hollow eyes that seemed too large for its skull. Its features were warped, its skin thin and stretched tight across its bones, like a mask barely holding itself together. Her heart raced as the figure extended one long, spindly hand toward her. Her chest tightened, and a cold sweat broke out over her skin. "You belong here," the creature whispered, its voice dripping with malice. Evelyn gasped, forcing herself to scramble backward across the floor, but the creature was faster. It was upon her in an instant, a dark, suffocating presence that pressed down on her chest as she lay frozen in place. Its hand hovered above her, its fingers impossibly long, reaching for her throat. "You brought us here," it hissed, the words sharp and venomous. Evelyn's pulse thundered in her ears, and her mind screamed for escape, for something, anything, that would save her from this nightmare. She shut her eyes tightly, trying to block out the sight of the creature looming above her, but the shadows seemed to close in tighter, suffocating her with their presence. A sudden surge of pain shot through her head, like an electric current coursing through her veins. She gasped, her body writhing against the unseen force, and then, with a sudden snap, everything stopped. The creature was gone, the shadows receded, the room, though still dim, was no longer suffocating. Evelyn lay on the cold floor, her breath ragged, her heart pounding in her chest. As she slowly opened her eyes, she was alone. The figure had vanished. But the sensation, the haunting feeling that it was still there, lurking just beyond her sight, remained. And then she heard it. A whisper, faint but unmistakable, echoing in her mind, "You are one of us now." Evelyn's body went stiff with terror. She pushed herself up, gasping for breath, and looked around the room, but it was empty. The door was closed. The shadows had returned to their quiet, watchful corners, but the words, those words, clung to her like a curse. She wasn't alone. Chapter 7. The Awakening. Evelyn's heart raced as she stood in the middle of the room, her breath shallow, feeling the weight of an oppressive silence pressing in from all sides. The lingering echo of the creature's whisper refused to leave her mind. It clawed at her thoughts, gnawing at the edges of her sanity. "You are one of us now," she pressed her palms against her temples, squeezing her eyes shut, as if to block out the words, but they still pulsed in the back of her skull, relentless. She opened her eyes and looked around the room again, half expecting the creature to reappear. The walls were still adorned with the eerie symbols, the strange patterns still mocking her from every direction. But this time, they weren't merely decorations, they were warnings. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to grow thicker, deeper. They twisted, flickering, as if they were alive, watching her. And then she felt it, an intense, gnawing sensation at the back of her neck. Someone or something was staring at her. Evelyn turned her head quickly, but there was nothing there. Just the shadows, just the silence. The room felt colder now, as though the temperature had dropped several degrees, and the air itself seemed heavier, thicker, like it was filled with a hidden presence that was making its way closer. A soft knock sounded from the door. Evelyn froze. Her eyes widened in terror. Her pulse quickened. She had been alone, she was certain of it. But now, as the soft knock came again, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was no longer the only one in the room. The door creaked open slowly, as if it had been waiting for permission. She didn't move, didn't even breathe as it swung wide. The darkness beyond the door was impenetrable, the hallway beyond a void, swallowing any light that might have dared to linger. Then came a voice, a soft, chilling whisper that seemed to emanate from the very walls around her. Evelyn, her name. The voice sounded so familiar, yet wrong. The moment it reached her ears, she felt the air around her grow denser, colder. It was a voice she had heard only in the darkest recesses of her nightmares, a voice that had once been her own. She stepped backward, her legs trembling. There was something inside her telling her to run, to leave, to get as far away from this house as possible. But her feet were frozen to the floor, and the voice continued, urging her to come closer. "Come," it beckoned. "Come and see." Her breath caught in her throat. The words weren't inviting, they were commanding. She could feel her body moving before her mind could process it. Her legs carried her forward, slowly at first, hesitant. But as her hand reached out toward the doorframe, she felt a coldness wrap around her wrist, cold fingers that felt like death itself. She jerked her hand back, gasping for breath, but the voice remained in her ears. It was everywhere now, filling her mind, spreading like poison through her veins. And then, something shifted in the darkness. A figure materialized from the shadows, a silhouette of something far too tall, far too thin to be human. Its face was a blur, a shape that barely made sense, as though it was both there and not there at all. But Evelyn could feel it watching her, could feel the malice in its unseen eyes. "Why do you fight it?" the figure asked, its voice warped and distorted, a sickening mixture of her own and something darker. "It was always meant to be this way. You belong with us." Evelyn shook her head, trembling, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She wanted to scream, but no sound escaped her throat. The room was closing in, the walls pressing inward, the air choking her. "You know," the figure continued, stepping closer, "what you saw before was only the beginning. You can't run from us, Evelyn. There's nowhere left to hide. Her eyes darted toward the window, her mind desperately searching for an escape, but the glass was opaque, clouded over with something that resembled fog, yet felt far more unnatural. The sky outside was not the blue she had once known. It was now a deep, swirling purple, like the color of bruised skin. The stars were gone, replaced by something much darker, something ancient. The figure reached out toward her, its long, gnarled fingers stretching, elongating with unnatural ease. Its touch would be unbearable, she knew. But she couldn't move. She was paralyzed by fear, frozen in place, her body betraying her, her will caged by the dread that consumed her. And then, in a single, swift motion, the figure's hand clamped down on her shoulder. The room spun around her, and the walls melted away. Everything she had known, the house, the shadows, the terror, vanished into a void of swirling darkness. Evelyn felt herself falling endlessly, as if time itself had shattered. Your hours now. The voice echoed again, but this time, it wasn't just in her ears. It was inside her mind, sinking into her very soul, twisting it, and she realized, with a deep, horrific certainty, that it was too late. There was no escape. The nightmares had consumed her, Evelyn screamed. But no sound emerged, the world had already folded in on itself. Chapter 8. The Hollow Echoes. Evelyn awoke with a sharp, gasping breath. Her body jerked upward, her hands gripping the bed sheets so tightly that her knuckles turned white. The room around her was eerily silent, the faint hum of the old fan her only company. The oppressive weight that had held her in the dream world was gone, replaced by the suffocating stillness of the waking world. She was back, but was she? The air in the room was thick, cloying, as if it was filled with something unseen, something that didn't belong. She could still feel the lingering trace of the creature's touch, cold, sharp, a mark upon her skin that refused to fade. Her heart hammered in her chest, and every shadow in the room seemed to move in ways that were wrong, unnatural. Evelyn slowly turned her head, taking in the familiar surroundings of her bedroom, but there was something unsettling about them now. The walls felt closer, the ceiling lower, the corners of the room shrouded in darkness. She could almost hear the whispers again, faint but unmistakable, like a chorus of voices scratching at the edges of her mind. Evelyn, come to us. Her breath caught. The voice had returned, but this time, it wasn't a whisper, it was an echo. A hollow, distorted reflection of itself, reverberating in her mind. The voice of the figure, the one that had called her, had followed her out of the dream. Her heart pounded as she pushed herself from the bed, her legs weak, her body still trembling from the intensity of the dream that felt far too real. She staggered toward the window, her eyes scanning the street outside. The early morning light filtered through the dusty blinds, casting long, thin shadows across the floor, but the world outside wasn't what she had expected. The street was empty, eerily so. The familiar houses stood in silence, their windows dark and uninviting. The trees in the yard no longer seemed to sway gently in the breeze. Instead, their limbs were twisted and crooked, like skeletal hands reaching toward the sky. The leaves were gray, lifeless, and the air held a heavy stillness as though the very breath of the earth had been stilled. Evelyn's throat tightened. She could feel the weight of something watching her from the shadows, just beyond her reach. The nightmare had bled into reality, and she had no idea how to stop it. The whispering grew louder. Evelyn, she spun around, heart thudding painfully in her chest. There, in the corner of the room, the shadows seemed to shift again, as though something was slowly moving within them. A figure, dark, indistinct, hovered at the edge of her vision, flickering like a broken reflection her breath caught. She could almost make out the features, but they slipped away the moment she tried to focus on them. Her heart hammered in her chest, a frantic rhythm that matched the ticking of the old clock on the wall. The figure's whisper became clearer, more distinct. "You can't escape, Evelyn. You belong to us." The words seemed to vibrate through her body, like a sudden electric shock, sending a jolt of ice through her veins. She staggered back, pressing her hands against the wall for support. The shadows were closing in on her, the darkness suffocating, filling every corner of the room, pooling around her feet like liquid. She tried to scream, but her voice was trapped inside her throat. Her hands trembled, her mind racing with desperate thoughts of escape. She had to leave. She had to get away from this house, from the thing that had followed her from the depths of her nightmares. But as she moved toward the door, her vision blurred, the edges of the room twisting and warping before her eyes. The shadows grew, thick and inescapable, until the room itself seemed to collapse into itself. The walls seemed to pulse with an unseen rhythm, the air thick with the sound of distant whispers, the faintest trace of footsteps behind her. The darkness was alive, and it was closing in. "No," Evelyn whispered, her voice a fragile thing. "I won't." The door to the room slammed shut with a deafening bang, trapping her inside. She spun around, but there was no escape. The figure in the shadows was now standing before her, its face still obscured, its presence pressing down on her like a physical weight. "Why do you resist?" the figure asked, its voice now a cold, mocking thing. "You were always meant to join us. You've been a part of us all along, Evelyn. Don't you see? You were never meant to escape." Evelyn backed away, her pulse racing. She could feel the cold creeping through her skin, could hear the ragged breath of someone behind her, closer now. And then, a pair of hands reached out of the darkness, skeletal and frail, their fingers brushing her skin, sending a shock of freezing terror through her body. "No," she screamed, tearing herself away from their grasp. She turned and ran, her feet stumbling on the uneven floorboards, her mind racing with panic. She had to get out, had to find a way to stop this nightmare before it consumed her completely. But as she reached the door again, it was locked. No matter how hard she tried to turn the knob, the door wouldn't budge. The air around her grew colder still, and the shadows seemed to draw closer, their whispers growing louder, more insistent. "You cannot run, Evelyn." She spun around, searching for the source of the voice, but there was no one there. The room was closing in on her, the shadows swallowing her, and she could feel her mind slipping, the thin line between reality and nightmare blurring with every passing second. As the darkness consumed her, she heard the voice again, a final whisper that seemed to echo through the very walls of the room. "You belong to the night now." And with that, the world went black. Chapter 9: The Edge of Perception. Evelyn's eyes fluttered open, but the darkness around her was all-consuming, a thick, suffocating veil that smothered her senses. For a moment, she couldn't tell if she was awake or still trapped in the nightmare. Her breath was shallow, uneven, her chest rising and falling in rapid succession. The coldness of the air bit into her skin, and she could feel the weight of something, a presence, lingering just out of sight. Her mind screamed for clarity, for escape, but the world around her had no answers, only shadows. She tried to move, but her limbs felt heavy, as if she was bound by invisible chains. The silence that stretched around her was deafening, the kind of silence that made every small sound, every breath, seem louder than it should be. Evelyn squeezed her eyes shut, willing herself to break free of the tight grip of panic that threatened to overtake her. Then, slowly, as though fighting against some unseen force, she managed to open her eyes once more. The room she found herself in was unfamiliar, yet familiar at the same time. The walls were coated in thick layers of dust, the air stale and still, as though no living thing had passed through this place in decades. The floorboards groaned beneath her, but there was no other sound, no other life. The faintest light filtered through what must have once been windows, but the glass was shattered, the frames long rusted and broken. She stood in the center of the room, disoriented, trying to gather her bearings. Her body felt lighter, as though the weight of reality itself had been momentarily lifted. But the feeling was fleeting, quickly replaced by the familiar sense of dread creeping up her spine. "Evelyn!" The voice whispered, not from one direction, but from every corner of the room, as if it was inside her head, wrapped in the hollow, drawn-out echoes of a dream she couldn't wake from. "Evelyn, don't you recognize us?" The voice twisted, turning from soft and seductive to sharp and demanding. She spun around, but there was nothing, no one, there. The shadows shifted unnaturally, curling and writhing like living things, pushing against the edges of the room as though they were desperate to get closer. The familiar pull of the nightmare was starting again, but this time, it wasn't just the creatures from her dreams reaching for her. It was them, the residents of her memories, the things that lingered on the edges of her consciousness, ready to devour her from within. She stumbled backward, her pulse quickening. A mirror caught her eye, one that had not been in the room when she first arrived. Its surface was cracked, splintered, distorting her reflection. She could see her face, pale, eyes wide with fear, but there was something wrong with it. Something unfamiliar. A voice, deep and guttural, rippled from the glass. "You've always been one of us, Evelyn." She recoiled, the mirror's reflection twisting until the edges of the image bled into the shadows around her. Her hands were shaking now, a tremor so intense it nearly made her knees give way. The whispering grew louder, growing more insistent, until it was a cacophony in her mind. The creatures, the whispers, the pull of the unknown, all of it was pulling her apart from the inside, but something inside her resisted. Evelyn gritted her teeth, drawing in a steadying breath. No, this time she wouldn't let them take her. She refused to let this nightmare consume her. She had to break free. She had to. Her thoughts were shattered by a sharp crack. The mirror, the last connection to the phantoms of her mind, shattered into 1,000 shards. The sound was deafening, overwhelming, and yet, it was the least terrifying thing she had encountered in this twisted world. Her reflection was gone, vanished, absorbed by the shards of glass that lay scattered across the floor, and then, through the now broken window, something shifted in the distance. First, it was a shadow, a large, unformed shape, drifting in and out of her vision. But as she strained her eyes to see more clearly, she saw it, something moving in the space beyond the broken walls of the room. Figures, human, or perhaps not, clad in tattered, dark clothing, standing still like statues under the pale light of a violet sky. Their faces were turned away from her, but she could sense them, watching. "Evelyn," came the whisper again, clearer now, as though the very walls were breathing the words. "It's not over. You can't escape us. You never could." The air grew thick, pressing down on her chest. The room, the world, felt as though it was shifting around her. The shadows twisted, lengthening, reaching for her in ways that felt wrong, unnatural. And then, the voices filled her mind once more, as if they were coming from inside her skull. "You belong to us, Evelyn." And with that, the shadows lunged. Chapter 10. The Final Dream. The darkness swirled around Evelyn, tightening its grip on her body, on her very soul. She could feel the weight of the nightmare closing in on her, suffocating her, drowning her in its endless, cold embrace. The shadows seemed to stretch out from every corner of the room, swallowing the fragile light that had once offered a fleeting sense of hope. She could hear them now, the creatures of her dreams, their whispers clawing at the edges of her mind, their voices hollow and monstrous, but Evelyn was no longer afraid. Not anymore. With every ounce of strength left in her, she focused. Her pulse raced, her breath shallow, but her mind was clearer than it had ever been before. The pull of the nightmare was still there, still tugging at her, but she had learned to resist it. She had learned to control it. She was not a victim anymore. She was the one who held the power, and she would not let them win. The figures in the shadows reached toward her, their eyes glowing with a sickly light, their mouths gaping open in silent screams. Evelyn could feel the cold tendrils of their presence sliding over her skin, crawling into her thoughts. But she pressed forward, her will burning bright, pushing against the pull of the darkness. She knew this was the final moment, the final battle. She had to face them now. Once and for all, she took a step forward, then another, each movement more determined than the last. The shadows recoiled, as if they recognized the shift in the air, as if they sensed the change within her. The creatures began to writhe, their forms twisting and distorting as if they were being torn apart by some invisible force. Evelyn did not look away. She did not falter. "You cannot hide from me anymore," she whispered, her voice steady, filled with a power she never knew she had. "I am not afraid of you." The shadows screamed. The sound was deafening, a cacophony of agony and rage that reverberated through her bones, but Evelyn stood tall. Her heartbeat was steady now, matching the rhythm of her thoughts. She could feel it, their presence beginning to fade, their hold on her weakening. The nightmare was no longer a thing of terror. It was a thing of her own making. With a final, defiant step, she reached the center of the room where the mirror had once stood. The pieces of shattered glass lay scattered at her feet, reflecting fragmented images of her face. She could see the woman she had been, a woman broken by fear, and the woman she was becoming. Strong, determined, unyielding, she raised her hand, her fingers brushing the fragments. The shards shuddered, as if they were alive, and for a moment, Evelyn thought they might rise again, reforming into something worse. But then, the light changed. The violet haze that had cloaked her world began to dissipate, as though the very fabric of the nightmare was unraveling. "You don't belong here," Evelyn whispered, her voice no longer trembling. "This is my world now." The shadows, the creatures, they writhed one final time, their forms cracking and splintering like the glass around her. The whispers grew frantic, desperate, but it was too late. The nightmare, once so solid, once so consuming, began to dissolve into nothingness. The last remnants of the darkness dissolved into the air, leaving behind a suffocating silence. Evelyn stood in the center of the room, breathing heavily but standing tall. The nightmare was over. She had broken free, but as the room faded around her, she realized something. She was not truly awake. The world she stood in, everything around her, was dissolving, slipping away like sand through her fingers. She wasn't sure if she had won or if she had merely traded one prison for another. Was she still trapped in the nightmare? Or was this the reality she had fought so hard to escape? She didn't have the answer. And perhaps, she realized, she never would. But as the last vestiges of the dream world faded, Evelyn closed her eyes. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, she found peace. Whether she was still in the nightmare or not, it no longer mattered. She had confronted her fears, faced the darkness within herself, and emerged stronger for it, and that, she knew, was all that mattered.